minute or two ago in employment relations terms about the collective context, I always thought that that was something where one could potentially miss a trick if you're not thinking about the collective nature of managing the employment relationship with or without trade unions. As you said, if you're putting the emphasis on teams, what is management? Getting things done through other people, but not just as individuals. Yes, the individuals, of course, have a crucial role, and you need to get and keep and motivate them, etc. But back to context again, putting it in the context of the collective setting, the team-based environment, and also for people to feel, the team that they're involved with, the immediate team, the team at a sort of intermediate level, and then that corporate entity. That there are quite a lot of things that people who are trying to advise people managing reward have got to think about in terms of the different levels at which you've got to pitch it: individual, collective, and what do we mean by that collective setting?
Yes, you've got to kind of think about, well, where's the weighting, between individual and team. So you don't want to suddenly create false teams just because the organization wants to have moved to team-based pay. It may not actually make sense. That said, there may be other ways of rewarding, collective achievement, which you need to think about. So yeah, so there's all this stuff around technology in terms of the reward practices, how those can evolve. But I suppose there's also implications for what, well, I suppose how reward professionals deliver that reward. Will they just kind of get AI to kind of communicate to their employees to explain things to them about the pension scheme or the share plan scheme or whatever? Well, they use new technology. You put all of the data in, you press a button, and suddenly that's it. That's your job. That's right. That's your pay review process done for the year and things like that. So so I think those are two big areas. But I think from my perspective, I think you've got to work out what reward practices you need before then you start thinking about, well, how do we deliver that? Because if you focus too much on the delivery, then you actually may be delivering something that's not actually desired or needed or wanted.
So we're back to the old conundrum, balancing efficiency with effectiveness. It might be very easy, say, to use any form of technology, from a simple HR information system to really advanced data modeling through large language models, and indeed reasoning agents now. But we do need still to think about the capacity empathetically, as you say, to understand, well, what is it that people are looking for? What do they need? What support do they require? How can they be better informed in the choices they are then responsible for? But also, how can they feel that sense of community fitting in as part of the team and the organization as a whole? So from a line management point of view, and with the HR people needing to give effective advice, it's balancing those things. Let's say you can do it perhaps in a cost efficient way, but is it cost effective?
Yes, I mean, I think the importance is that when you think about any technological innovation, think of making it people focused, because that will presumably have a bigger impact. So kind of working with people rather than rather than doing something to them, working with them in terms of technology.
Yeah. Takes us neatly to perhaps the area of hybrid working, something that was really accelerated again during the pandemic era. some pressure at the moment. We've heard it in the news about employers wanting people to return to the office, but actually creating significant reaction. I mean, even stories in the headlines about civil servants, they'll say they'll go on all-out strike for being required to return 2 days a week to the office. Um, let's get away from the hype. But what are the underlying issues, do you think, about hybrid working and reward management, particularly bearing in mind what we've just talked about in terms of managing the human versus the technology side?
Well, I mean, early on in the pandemic, and people were working, from anywhere through technology, people were thinking, well, is there a point in having a location allowance? Is if is London waiting? Um, does it still make sense? And some organisations started offering, different salaries depending on whether they were based within London or outside. And I suppose the challenge there is that you could perhaps do that for new employees, but it's harder for existing. Um, and if you then have two employees doing the same work but getting different pay, you can see where that's going to potentially end up. So there doesn't seem to be much on the London waiting front, for instance. You haven't seen many organisations abandoning it. What may happen is that it will just wither on the vine, and organisations will just have one rate, and it depends whether you actually are in, respectively whether you're in the office all the time or just a few days a week. But of course, then you've got issues around, are you going to pay people to come into the office? And also, the transport system isn't particularly brilliant either. So it can be an effort to get into the office, and are people, in the best frame of mind if they've struggled all the way in and then they think, oh gosh, I've got to now struggle all the way back again. But yes, I mean, there is a debate though about innovation and creativity, and whether that that loses out if people aren't in the office. I don't know. I mean, there's a big debate, isn't there? People talk about water cooler moments, but were people actually having water cooler moments 6 or 7 years ago? Suddenly standing, chatting to one another, and suddenly having this light bulb moment that's going to change the world. Not sure. But yes, as you said, there's employee relations issues, and all people saying, I can do my work just as well as I can from my home. Why do I have to come into the office? How can you demonstrate this? And it can be difficult for an HR to say, well, this is what's been determined by but by senior management. They believe that these things are being missed out on. But yeah, I mean, there's massive ripple-on effects, because I mean, for instance, places like Canary Wharf, these big, massive tower blocks now. What's going to happen to them if people aren't? You don't need as many people in there. So it's not just how we do our work, and when and where and how, but then has implications for other parts of the economy. Which is odd, actually, because as I'm reading that, Kemi Badenoch said UK, HR was running the economy, the British economy. So I, I mean, I think that's perhaps an exaggeration, but I think how people are managed and rewarded and developed does have an impact, that's unsurprising, on the British economy.
Yes. I know that
So
when chatting with Duncan Brown, he was quoting some American research that said that one of the things that the pandemic has certainly impacted, according to this study, this was looking in the US, but I suspect it's quite widespread, was that yes, it's not that HR are running the economy, but HR has really got to the top of the executive agenda in a way that it never had in the past because of this multiplicity of issues,
Mm,
the whole hybridity, the acute labour shortages, the thinking about the sunk costs in physical workspaces, but then perhaps backing up in terms of thinking about what has been in the lexicon for a while now, the total reward package or the compelling employee proposition. Actually, is that control over where you are working and how you are working? Actually, has that become a core reward issue in a way that no one would ever have conceived of really only a few years ago?
well, I think if you looked at things like flexible working, hybrid working, what's called family friendly, they tended to be in the public and voluntary sectors because I suppose it was one response to not having the money to compete with the private sector. And now the private sector, in many parts of the private, have kind of caught up. So this then creates challenges for the public sector because you can't say, well, come and work for us because you got flexible working arrangements. When you say, well, actually, so as the private sector. So they've got to think about their, total rewards, employee value proposition, whatever the phrase is at the moment, to try and create a compelling reason for you wanting to kind of come to that organization, um, and exhibit the behaviors, skills, and performances that the organization needs. And also then you think about using reward as a either as a strategic lever to kind of get that, or working out, well, not so much a strategic lever as it was described as damage limitation to try and work out how do we avoid messing all this up by paying people, because how you reward, well, how people perceive reward can differ from how you or the original intention.
So there's an awful lot wrapped up in there. So again, we're back to perceptions, we're back to communication. We talked earlier on about the global context that one needs to be sensitive to now. And also, when we were talking about hybrid working and the reward consequences, this idea of two people side by side being rewarded differently. In the international reward environment, that's long been an issue, hasn't it? People who are parachuted in, but sit alongside some people who seem to have an equal contribution to the organisation and yet are paid vastly differently. Suddenly it's become a domestic as much as an international issue, one might suggest.
Well, yes, I mean, you've got if you've got people doing exactly the same job but they're being paid differently, then that can lead to questions of fairness. Now, if the person getting paid less is a woman and the person getting paid more than is the man, or vice versa, then there are in many countries the ability to go through you know an equal pay, go for an equal pay claim. um, the organization really does need to kind of say, well, can't really say, well, we brought this person in and that's why we give it, from overseas, and we've got to pay that person more money, um, unless you can demonstrate that they've got unique skills or experiences that you want to share. um, and of course, one consequences of development in communication technology is that actually a lot of these skills can be quite easily um, shared over the internet, or whatever. You can kind of pick them up relatively easily and quickly. So do you really need to send somebody over um, to kind of to, into that area? Um, so yes, I mean, not all countries have the equal pay laws that we do, or in the UK, and sorry, in Europe, or the West. But over time, I'd imagine, more countries saying, well, we've got, this is what this is the direction of travel, and we're going to have to do that, especially if um, pay transparency is increasing. People are more companies are more likely to want to put information in job ads or being forced to, whilst people are quite happy to talk about their reward experiences on TikTok or on social media such as LinkedIn or Glassdoor.
Yes, you're right. So people are creating their own world of transparency. And I think what I'm hearing from what you've just said, that compelling story, the narrative, is something that reward professionals really need to be alive to, supporting their organization. It's not just what is the compelling employee proposition, but actually it's how do you have a narrative that accompanies the kinds of strategic choices, the trade-offs the organization is making, so they don't fall foul of equality and fairness, not just legislation, but just the right way to operate. That kind of nicely segues towards, as we're starting to bring things in our conversation to a conclusion, Charles, what do you think would be your key messages for then the aspirant reward professional studying today, going into their practice, looking towards the future?
Well, there's the technical skills that you'll need, everything from Excel and Word, and communication skills, analysis skills, which are important. But then it's your influencing skills. How do you influence your colleagues, management, employees, etc.? And that perhaps goes back to what you said earlier, Stephen, around short term, long term, medium term, thinking about, well, what is something that's, as an organization, we're always going to be committed to. What's our long term objectives, a long term EVP, but things happen, these in the short term, medium term. So what could happen, and how we would then have to say, well, this is what the impact is, and this is how it affects us. But it doesn't really kind of change our core purpose. It just changes what we do, how we do it, when we do it, and how we kind of reflect that in telling people, because it can be a bit of a challenge. You employ somebody, one set of terms and conditions and expectations, etc., and then 6 or 7 years ago, sorry, 6 or 7 years later, everything's changed, and you still want to keep that person with you, and then you have to kind of say, well, what's the compelling narrative for that? So having a compelling narrative, but being mindful that that has to change and evolve over time.
Mm. Yeah, so continuing professional development, obviously for people, it doesn't end when they achieve their accreditation. Obviously, they've got to do it as professionals anyway to retain their accreditation. But what you really are saying is that that's something inside as well as outside the organisation is crucial. And it goes from, of course, you've got to have the smart basics to be able to do the job. But if you're really going to succeed in reward, as you say, it's being able to craft and help the organisation with that compelling employee value proposition that's dynamic and changing to circumstances. That's been a really fascinating
Yeah,
conversation. Thank you.
that's good.
Have I missed anything? Are there any aspects you think I should have asked you and that we haven't yet touched on?
5 hours later, uh, no. I mean, you've got the key ones. I mean, you've got all the stuff around the technological changes, the opportunities, as well as the challenges around AI and algorithms and technology. Um, but I suppose you also have to realize that some organizations that kind of just is going to go by them. If you're running a chain of chip shops or florists or um, something like that, dry cleaners, how you reward and recognize your people are influenced by a different set of factors. And I suppose it's always kind of worth remembering that most organizations in the UK and presumably in the rest of the world are micro businesses or small businesses, and how they reward and recognize their people is less formal than we assume when we kind of talk about the annual pay rise or pay structures and the benefits there. It can be very different. So
Indeed.
just because you happen to work in a bank or for a bank or for a the NHS or uh, for a tech firm, don't assume that what goes on there goes on in the rest of the economy. And if you are thinking of moving outside of your sector rather than within it, you have to be aware of how other organizations in different contexts approach reward and recognition.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles.
That's all
Really
right.
time.
And always happy to support your endeavors. And if you want me to, I can flag your videos more widely as well.
That would be excellent. Thank you very, very much indeed.